My son looked at me across a table full of his in-laws, his business partner, and 12 other guests, and said 6 words that ended something in me. "You're an embarrassment at family dinners, Dad." Everyone laughed. Even his wife laughed, a little too quickly, the way people laugh when they're relieved the joke landed on someone else. I set down my fork, wiped my mouth, and said nothing. 3 weeks later, his business partner called me. Not my son, his partner. And what he said on that phone call is the reason I'm telling you this story tonight. My name is Gerald Thomason. I'm 69 years old. I spent 41 years running a small precision manufacturing company out of a converted warehouse in Dayton, Ohio. Machine parts, mostly. The unglamorous kind of business that keeps other businesses running without anyone thinking twice about who made the part. I sold the company 6 years ago, after my wife Marion was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. I wanted the time with her more than I wanted the business. I don't regret that decision for a single second, even on the hard days. My son, Bradley, is 38. Sharp, driven, the kind of man who reads a room and adjusts himself to fit whatever version of himself will land best in it. He started a logistics consulting firm 4 years ago with a partner named Curtis Nolan. A soft-spoken, careful man I'd met maybe 6 or 7 times over the years. Always at family functions, always polite, always watching more than he spoke. Bradley married a woman named Vanessa 2 years ago. Bright, well-connected, from a family that measures success in a particular kind of visible polish. I liked Vanessa fine. I just noticed, early on, that Bradley started talking about me differently once she was in the picture. Less like a son talking about his father, more like a man managing an image. There's a man named Otis Reyes who used to work the floor at my old company. 32 years as a machinist. Retired now. Lives 2 streets over from me. Otis and I built something over 3 decades that outlasted the paychecks. When Marion got her diagnosis, Otis showed up at our door within a day. No phone call first. Just his truck in the driveway and a casserole his wife had made. And he sat with me on the porch for 2 hours, without either of us saying much of anything. Otis never went to college. Never ran a company, never sat at the head of a boardroom table. But when I think about who actually shows up when it matters, Otis is the first name that comes to mind, every single time, without hesitation. I bring Otis up because of something small he said to me a few months before that dinner. We were fixing a fence post together, and out of nowhere he said, "You ever notice your boy gets quiet when you're around people he's trying to impress?" I laughed it off at the time. Otis wasn't wrong though. He rarely was. It had been building for months before that dinner. Small things. Bradley introducing me to Vanessa's friends as my dad. He used to tinker with machines, which technically wasn't a lie, but wasn't the truth either. At his firm's holiday party last year, when someone asked what I used to do, Bradley answered for me. Small manufacturing thing, nothing too exciting, before I'd even opened my mouth. I let it go every time. I've never needed my son to announce my resume to strangers. What I did need, though I didn't fully admit it to myself yet, was for him to stop being ashamed of where he came from, in front of people whose approval he'd apparently decided mattered more than mine. Marion noticed it before I did. She always did. A few weeks before the dinner, she said to me, quietly, from her wheelchair by the window, "Bradley's changing the story of who raised him, Gerald. I don't know if he even realizes he's doing it." I told her she was overthinking it. She wasn't. The dinner was at Vanessa's parents' house, a large, tasteful home with a dining table long enough to seat 16. Curtis Nolan was there too, seated near the middle, quiet as always, nursing a glass of wine and watching the room the way he always did. Dinner was going fine until Vanessa's father, a retired orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Whitmore, asked me, politely, what kind of work I'd done before retiring. I told him the truth, plainly, the way I always have. Ran a precision manufacturing company for 41 years. Machine parts, mostly. Started it in a rented warehouse with 2 employees. Sold it a few years back. Before Dr. Whitmore could respond, Bradley cut in, laughing, a laugh that had an edge under it I recognized but couldn't name yet. "Dad, come on. Nobody wants the full factory tour speech at dinner." A few people chuckled politely, the way people do when they're not sure if something's actually funny but sense they're supposed to react. I said, evenly. He asked a direct question, Bradley. I gave him a direct answer. And that's when it happened. Bradley set down his wine glass, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. something between embarrassment and irritation, and said it. "You're an embarrassment at family dinners, Dad. Can we please just have one normal evening without you turning it into a whole thing?" The table went quiet for exactly 1 second, then filled with the particular scramble of people trying to smooth over something they all felt land wrong. Vanessa laughed first, a bright, nervous sound, and said, "Bradley, be nice," in a tone that suggested she wasn't entirely disagreeing with him. I looked down the table. Curtis Nolan wasn't laughing, he was watching me, very carefully, with an expression I couldn't read at the time. I set down my fork. I said nothing else for the rest of the meal. I drove Marian and myself home in silence, and when we got inside, she reached for my hand and said, "I heard him too, Gerald. I'm sorry. I didn't call Bradley that week. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't dignity, or restraint exactly. It was that I genuinely didn't know what to say to my own son that wouldn't come out sounding like either an accusation or a plea, and I didn't want to be either of those things to him. So I did what I've always done when something sat heavy in my chest. I went to my old workshop in the garage, the one I kept even after selling the company, and I worked with my hands until the noise in my head quieted down. 10 days after the dinner, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, Curtis Nolan. He said he hoped it was all right that he'd reached out directly, that he'd gotten my number from Bradley's contacts a while back for an unrelated reason, and had been debating whether to call for over a week. He said he needed to ask me something, and he needed an honest answer. "Gerald," he said, "when you ran your manufacturing company, did you ever work with a supplier network out of the Midwest called Ferris Component Group?" I told him yes. I'd built that supplier relationship myself, over nearly 2 decades, negotiating contract terms that had been, at the time, considered nearly impossible to secure for a company our size. There was a long pause on the line. Then Curtis said, "Gerald, that's the exact supplier network we've been trying to get access to for our biggest client for the last 8 months. Bradley told me his father used to run a small manufacturing outfit. He never once mentioned you built the relationship with Ferris personally." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, phone still to my ear, and I explained it to Curtis plainly. Ferris Component Group didn't work with just anyone. The relationship required a level of trust built over years, references that mattered, a track record their leadership actually remembered. I still had a personal relationship with their CEO, a man named Dale Ferris, someone I'd golfed with a handful of times even after retiring. Curtis was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that landed harder than anything Bradley had said at that dinner table. "Gerald, we've been trying to land this client for 8 months. If you're willing to make one phone call, it could be the biggest contract our firm has ever signed. Bradley's own father is sitting on the exact relationship we've been chasing, and he never thought to mention it." I asked Curtis, carefully, if Bradley knew he was calling me. "No," Curtis said. "I found the connection myself, going through old supplier records for a different project. Bradley's never talked about your career in any detail I can remember. Honestly, Gerald, from the way he talks about you at the office, I assumed you'd mostly been retired your whole life. I had no idea what you actually built." I sat with that for a long moment. My own son's business partner knew more about the shape of my career from a supplier database than from 38 years of conversation with his father. I told Curtis I'd think about the introduction, and I meant it. I wasn't interested in punishing my son by withholding help out of spite. That's not who I raised myself to be, whatever Bradley thinks of me at dinner tables. But I also wasn't going to pretend the call hadn't happened. I called Bradley that evening. I told him, plainly, that Curtis had reached out. I watched through the silence on the line as he pieced together what that meant, that his own business partner knew more about my career's actual weight than he did, that the connection he'd been chasing for 8 months had been sitting across from him at every family dinner for years. "Dad," he said finally, his voice different than I'd heard it in a long time. "I didn't know it was you. I mean, I knew what you did, but I never really asked what it meant." I told him the truth. "You never asked, Bradley, not once, in 38 years. I stopped waiting for the question a long time ago." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I'm sorry about the dinner. That wasn't fair. Any of it." I made the introduction to Dale Ferris 2 weeks later. Not as a reward, not as a lesson, just because it was the right thing to do for my son's business, regardless of how he'd spoken to me. The deal closed 4 months after that. The largest contract Bradley's firm had ever signed. But the thing that actually changed wasn't the business. It was Sunday dinner, 3 weeks after the contract closed, when Bradley stood up in front of the same table, the same crowd, and said, without me asking him to, I want to actually tell you all what my dad built before he retired, because I don't think I ever really understood it myself until recently. I didn't say a word, I just let him talk. If you've ever had someone in your family finally understand your worth a little too late, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if this story meant something to you, there's another one waiting for you right here.